The call of XCOM 2 occurred for me again recently. It's guaranteed to happen at least once a year. The game improves on Firaxis' reboot of the original XCOM in 2012 in many different ways. When I get that XCOM itch, it's always XCOM 2 that I return to these days, and the excellent expansion War of the Chosen. It's the game I've played the most on my Steam list, not just XCOM games of all time, just shy of 1,000 hours. At this point in 2023. It's a sobering discovery for me. The game has caused me to uninstall it repeatedly in rage, only to reinstall it a month later when I've calmed down. But the point of this review is to answer the question, is it still worth playing in 2023, particularly for a new player? The answer is yes from my point of view, but it's kind of weird that it's still such a resounding yes after the game came out 7 years ago, that there aren't more AAA competitors of this quality and polish out there to rival it. Firaxis themselves tried quite recently with the very flashy Marvel's Eternal Suns, but by all accounts it seems to have done very modestly compared to XCOM. It seems like turn-based strategy in general is a somewhat impoverished genre in terms of choice. Most recently I've played Phantom Brigade, an excellent turn-based mech game, Hard West, XCOM with cowboys, the remake of Tactics Ogre, one of the OG Japanese games in the genre and the precursor to Final Fantasy Tactics, which is rumoured to be getting the remake treatment also. But XCOM 2 contains some special sauce that these other games don't. If someone new to turn-based strategy asked me what game they should play first, my answer would always be XCOM 2. Just tell them not to start at anything above normal difficulty and forget about Legend until you've played through the game at least a couple of times. If I knew what this special sauce was, I'd tell you, and I suspect game devs would be making more games like this. I believe it's got something to do with its deceptively simple two-move system, move shoot, move, or move and hunker, etc., all displayed very logically with blue or gold lines of trajectory within obvious ranges of movement. The fact that you can look at the battlefield and read the tactical situation without recourse to tooltips or in-depth knowledge of the enemy types is a big part of the accessibility for people. Which of your guys is in cover, half shields, full shields, which aliens are exposed, their cheery alien symbol turns yellow, you know that is the guy that I need to shoot first. This is why Firaxis XCOM blows away other tactics games, I believe, because of its mass appeal, its simplicity. Veterans of the game, and I suppose I'm one of them at this point, might take umbrage with that, knowing how deep and complex it actually is. But in reality, the simplicity is as important to its success as the intricacy. Put simply, people who wouldn't usually play turn-based tactics games will play XCOM 2. I mentioned Phantom Brigade, which I played recently and reviewed on the channel, and it takes several cues from the Firaxis XCOM games, the cinematic presentation, for instance. But its unique selling point, the ability to see what enemies will do 5 seconds in the future, it leads to this complex system for controlling your mechs that will be immediately off-putting to someone who's not sold on the genre, hasn't played many of these games. I hope it's very successful, but it's the obtuse tactical controls that will mean that game probably remains fairly niche. Same thing for stalwarts in the genre like Tactics Ogre, which I mentioned, where to understand who you've just recruited into your party, you have to stare at a wall of stats. Contrast that with XCOM 2, where all of your guys are pretty much identical at the start of the game, and it's easy to intuit what they should be doing once they level up. That guy has a grenade launcher and a minigun. Can you guess what he does? Yes, you can, and so can most people. You can see that mass appeal was at the forefront of the designer's mind. The genius of the game is that it also appeals to grizzled experts who will crank the difficulty level up to Legend and select Iron Man mode, where you're not allowed to reload and mistakes are permanent, including complete squad wipes. The game's not perfect and I'm going to talk about that, but I wanted to put up front the reasons why I think that it's still worth playing in 2023 and very approachable for anyone unfamiliar with the genre. With that out of the way, I don't like it as much as Enemy Within. Or more accurately, I don't like the setting or the atmosphere as much as the original game. Shifting the story into the near future, making the failure of XCOM canon, the premise is that you as the commander failed in the first game. The choice to turn XCOM from a government-funded entity, because there's no government anymore, into a ragtag gang of guerrillas is a great decision, certainly better than the 90s XCOM where the sequel was just a reskin and took place underwater at the bottom of the ocean. But for me it just doesn't resonate quite as strongly as that enemy within game. They obviously try to keep the landscape somewhat recognizable. There are future gas stations, future offices, future convenience stores, future slums, but that subtle shift means that some of the B-movie charm is lost. The original setting felt like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or a gory episode of The X-Files or The Twilight Zone, where the ordinary world is contrasted against the weirdness that the aliens bring with them. The sectoids, little bulb-headed stereotypical alien guys scampering through gas stations, hiding behind vending machines. There was an absurdity but also a wonderful quirkiness and eeriness to that original game that's somewhat lost in XCOM 2, and I miss it. Those same sectoids are now intimidating skeletal monstrosities that snarl and clench their fists. They know exactly what they want when they see you. They are gonna murder you. We never knew what the original sectoids were up to. Why were the aliens here? What did they want? Now we know, to turn us into slaves or worse. The mystery's gone, and I'm not saying there's any way to make that not the case. We can't go back in time, but I miss it, and that's why I say I probably prefer Enemy Within, even though that's not the game I go back to because I know it all already. The mechanics of this game and the feel of this game make this the one that I return to, but I'm selling XCOM 2 short as well. The Avatar project is mysterious, the gene clinics are mysterious, what the aliens were doing with the commander is a puzzle that needs unraveling. The writers have tried to keep some of the mystery there, and I'm cognizant of that. And you've got to evolve things or they will stagnate. I do understand it. I'm trying to think of other turn-based games that I've played in maybe the past 5 or 10 years that have triggered the same one more turn compulsion, but I honestly can't think of very many. Maybe Total War Warhammer, it's an RTS, but the overland part, the strategic part, is turn-based as you try to position units to counter the enemy. It's a curious quality and perhaps stems in XCOM 2 from the sense that you can never really relax. You never know what the enemy is going to throw at you next, and the next mission could always be the one that ends a run. The only way to really find out is to play that next mission. Even in the end game of XCOM 2, certainly at higher difficulties, your squad of elites can still be wiped when bog standard missions start spawning 2 sectopods or packs full of Andromedans. This is a definite improvement over the original, by the end of which nothing could really touch you. In terms of storytelling and character, the game does its best to inject emotion, better than the original. Central is now a grizzled veteran. In the Alien Rulers DLC you can play him also, and they take key characters from the earlier game and build on them. The engineer Shen is replaced by his daughter, who discovers her father's legacy through another DLC mission, which leads to a genuinely touching scene towards the end where she connects with her father who's passed away. It's all in an effort to inject character, tell a cinematic story whilst allowing the player complete freedom with squad management and customization of their characters and who they think of as the commander. You really need to remain faceless in that respect, so it's the supporting cast that have been given a lot of love in XCOM 2. They expanded upon this still further with the game's biggest DLC, War of the Chosen, which injects named antagonists for the first time, giving a face to what has been a nebulous, somewhat inscrutable enemy. Those ethereals have really done a number on the Earth's population, convincing people that the puppet regime of Advent is a benevolent peacekeeping force. It's very effective, and it puts in place a rank and file that can be mowed down through the course of the story, yet always remains threatening through sheer weight of numbers, but also some tricky subclasses, the Stun Lancer and the Priest being two of the most infuriating. The game seems ridiculously unfair at times though. The first time you encounter a Stun Lancer and it runs across the map, stabbing and instantly killing your sergeant, it will break you. There's no two ways about it. I don't care if you're the Dalai Lama, when that happens this game will make you want to carpet bomb a country. It's rage inducing, but all the while you can see what you might have done different, or if the dice rolled differently you might have survived. The Chosen, particularly the Warlock, is another of those infuriating classes, if you can call him a class, he's his own entity. If the random generation which assigns Chosen to a given region places the Warlock in your starting area, the compulsion to start over is very strong. He can mind control your team, something for which you have no counter in the early game. It's doable, Things are always doable in the game, but it's dicey, pun intended, every step of the way. I'm heaping praise on praise, and I'm not sure if it actually sounds like that, but I am. This is all good stuff. The fact that you get angry and infuriated at games, you would think that must be a negative at the game. Not necessarily. But the game isn't without its faults, as I said, and I do want to talk about some of them. I think for a series that trades so heavily on customizing your squad, the choices are fairly limited. You can rename everyone, you can pick different nationalities, so you can have guys speaking German, French. It's not comprehensive, but there's stuff like that. But the actual visual customization is not there's not as much there as I would have liked. The options added with the DLCs as well, I'm thinking about the Anarchy's Children pack specifically, were frankly stupid, just a complete misstep. Instead of more helmets, hairstyles, camo options or suitable combat gear, they added a bunch of stupid skull masks and the ability to face paint your soldiers so they look like the aliens. It's like the devs had completely forgotten the tone of the game. They'd gone stir crazy at that point. What the Avengers crew stood for or what they were fighting for, started to wish they were making Saints Row instead. The only thing missing is a glowing pink dildo for the Ranger instead of his sword in that particular pack. The game's story, cutscenes and voice lines also become infuriating over time. Again, this open, designed for multiple playthroughs, really needs a no voiceover option. Once you know it all like the back of your hand, there's no need to listen to it all again. There are persistent problems with the game's design mechanically. The enemy within suffer from this too. Despite the approachability for new starters, which I mentioned, there are certain quirks that you do have to learn, either through trial and error or through research. As an example, the way the game handles cover can be counterintuitive at times. The shields are very helpful, but sometimes an enemy can be at a firing angle that visually suggests the cover your soldier is hiding behind shouldn't matter, but because of the way the game's maps are built, comprised of these squares that are invisible for the most part until you're counting out your movements, mechanically that soldier still counts as fully protected, even though visually it doesn't seem to. There can be situations where it makes sense you'd be flanking the enemy, but you aren't because of the map's grid and the way things line up. It's a persistent problem. I'm not sure if I'm making 100% sense. It's very hard to explain. But another problem is the disconnect between the player and the game when you literally stick a gun in the alien's face and you miss because it's all dice rolls. I can see why they haven't changed that, because putting in too many things that guarantee hits is inherently exploitable, but having the players perform a rifle butt maybe, or perhaps a canned animation that shows the enemy knocking the gun out of alignment so the shot goes off, it would go a long way towards selling those close quarters encounters. I could mention other quirks: firing through the walls when you shouldn't be able to, dodgy cinematic camera angles. Suffice to say, there is plenty of room for improvement when it comes to XCOM 3. On that topic, I'm surprised we haven't heard a peep yet. They must be working on it. I googled it for this review and I came up with a big fat zero, apart from a bunch of articles, 500 word articles that basically say I don't know jack shit. XCOM Chimera Squad came out in the meantime and it was a fun diversion. I might talk more about that in a separate review, but it was missing too many of the elements that make the core XCOM games so compelling, squad customization being an obvious one. Enemy Unknown came out in 2012 and XCOM 2 in 2016. That's a gap of 4 years. We're coming up on 7 years since XCOM 2 now. War of the Chosen was a meaty expansion to the core gameplay. According to my research though, that came out in 2017. It feels like there was more of a gap between the initial release and War of the Chosen. But either way, I think it's safe to say people are ready for a new installment in the franchise. Mods are your plaything until then, and the game is highly moddable, with total overhauls like Long War, which increases the duration of the game, adds in new units. It's a slightly different style of play really overall. It feels significantly different, Long War, to the vanilla game and to War of the Chosen. Two really modest mods like bug fixes, the ability to evac all squad members at once. Why that wasn't in the core game, I've no idea. I've gone through the game with a fair few mod lists running and they make for an interesting variation on that core gameplay. You can go completely crazy and give every one of your guys a shredder rocket that reduces every alien to and the terrain to dust. There's even a Star Wars mod. because, of course, there's always a Star Wars mod. In terms of a comprehensive package for turn-based tactics then, XCOM 2, it's still difficult to beat in 2023. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say currently, it can't be beaten. It still sits at the top of the tree in the genre, even 7 years since release, and I haven't heard of anything on the horizon that is likely to challenge it until we see XCOM 3. Thanks for watching, guys. Sub and like and all that. Watch other videos. I've been Napyet, and I'll see you next time.